Good morning. Bienvenue. Welcome. I'm very pleased this morning to welcome you, each and every one, to the second annual Scholars Symposium at the University of Maine at Fort Kent. This year's theme is Bridging Our Future, Culture, Conflict, and Convergence. I'd like to say a few words of introduction about some of our guests today, and I'd also like to thank some people. But before I do that, I'd just like to take a few moments of your time and reflect upon how significant the concept of the Scholars Symposium is. It's what we educators in our lexicon call authentic assessment. The meaning of that for all of you in the audience perhaps can be told in a little metaphor. It's like teaching someone how to sail a boat and then giving them a paper test to see if they're good sailors. That's how some assessment works. Authentic assessment would be to teach someone how to sail a boat and say, okay, now go out and sail a boat. That's what the Scholars Symposium is about. It's about putting models in front of all of us as an academic community as to what academic discourse and dialogue is all about, and then inviting our students to come forward and show us that they know how to sail that boat. So the Scholars Symposium is about that authentic expression of what we do here on a day-to-day basis at the University of Maine Fort Kent. And I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking everyone who's contributed their intellect and their thought to today's symposium. Thank you all very much. The theme that we've been asked to work with, the sub-theme is this issue of culture, conflict, and convergence. And I think we're going to have ample opportunity in our speakers today to have a global and a regional and a local understanding of what that cultural conflict and convergence can be all about, and how rich it is. I would like to recognize several of our guests who will be on our panels later today. First of all, I'd like to recognize our own Lise Pelletier, who will be as part of the panel. Lise, as you know, was born in Fort Kent, raised across the river, and she's a proud Franco-American. She has been a passionate advocate of the preservation of the Franco-American culture, the culture of the St. John Valley, and our heritage. She, of course, is the director of our own Acadian Archives. We're pleased to have you part of our panels today. Thank you, Lise. I'd also like to welcome Lise Pelletier from the former Yugoslavia. Spent nearly 3 years in the besieged city of Sarajevo in the 1990s. Worked for International Rescue Committee as a driver and legal advisor. That sounds like Hemingway to me. And escaped to the United States, resettled in San Francisco. He holds a law degree from the University of Sarajevo in the former Yugoslavia. And is a doctoral student at the University of Kansas, Lawrence. Lise Pelletier, welcome. And before I introduce our keynote speaker, I would like to offer some thanks. I'd like to thank the many people who are listed in your program who have worked so hard and so diligently to put this wonderful day together. I won't read them all because we would cut into our keynote speaker's time, but thanks to each and every one of them, but special thanks to two people. Assistant Professor Soraya Cardenas, thank you for your leadership in this effort. special thanks to Nikki Willette, who has been a driving force in making things happen. Nikki, thank you very much. I would also like to remind you that lunch will open at 11:15. If you want to get out there early and get started, please find your way over to Nowland Hall for lunch. I would also like to remind folks of the poster sessions, which will be over in the Sports Center at 1:30 today. They are part of the heart and soul of this authentic assessment exercise. Please go over and take a look at those. I would also like to ask everyone throughout the day to do what I'm going to do right now, which is to reach into your pocket and pick up your cell phone, your BlackBerry, or your iPod, and turn it off or put it in the mute position. So if you'd be kind enough to do that out of respect for all of our presenters today. Our keynote speaker for this year's symposium comes to us from Arizona, just about as far as you can come in the continental United States, crossways to Fort Kent. She's professor of Mexican-American Raza Studies at the University of Arizona. She's a former professor of Chicano Studies and German Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She studied at 4 different German universities. Those faculty present talk about a retention problem. Sorry, inside education joke. As an undergraduate, she attended the University of Arizona, graduated with Phi Beta Kappa. She's a native of the Arizona Sonora Desert, which is a beautiful part of this country if you've never been there, and is rooted in the Yaqui Mexican culture. Throughout her career, she's blazed trails for women and women's rights. She's the first indigenous woman to receive a doctorate in German studies, and later the first woman of color to be tenured at the University of California, Santa Barbara. In 1991, she became the first Native Chicano woman to chair an academic department within the University of California system, and was among the first Native women in the nation to be promoted to full professor at a major research university. In 1996, our speaker was honored with a Lifetime Distinguished Service Award from the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies. Her other distinguished national and international awards have come from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Ford Foundation, the Fulbright Foundation, and the German Academic Exchange. Focal points of her research and teaching are popular culture, gender, oral tradition, Native American culture, and the popular performance genres of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Among her most recent publications is the first academic study of the legendary singer and National Medal of Arts recipient, Lydia Mendoza. Would you please join me this morning in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Yolanda Broles Gonzalez.
Leo Sinchaniago, buenos dias, good morning, buenos dias. The Leo Sinchaniago is in the Yaqui language, which is a desert tribe that I belong to. And I'm deeply honored and happy to be here at this symposium, and with Professor Hess. I want to thank all the organizers. This is a huge undertaking, and Soraya Cardenas was my main point person and organizer in my eyes. I thank you all for this remarkable gathering. And thank you for inviting me. The topic that was given to me is, in my consideration, the most important topic of our time, bridging our future, culture, conflict, and convergence. And I'm going to focus on this topic of culture and convergence, and most especially harmonious convergence, because you can converge in a non-peaceful way as well. as is my Native American custom, I want to first acknowledge the spirit of this land and the ancestors of this place, the original peoples of this place, the Maliseets, the people of the beautiful river, and the related Wabanaki peoples, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Abenaki. I also want to acknowledge each of you that is here today and the confluence of cultures represented by our coming together. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to reflect on this topic of conflict and convergence. Our shared responsibility for a harmonious convergence is surely one of the greatest challenges of our time. We are all responsible for taking up the challenge of building bridges to unite and to heal what appears separated, what is conflicted and divided, what appears irreconcilable and incompatible. We are each capable of taking up that challenge of convergence, of harmonious convergence, instead of deepening the divides that separate us. Nothing is more important to consider than our collective future as one human race upon one precious earth. Nothing is more urgent than cultivating peaceways, the practices of what I call here harmonious convergence, the practices of finding common ground, of love, of social justice. Harmonious convergence presupposes the mutuality of respect and a coming together under mutually acceptable terms. What could be more desirable than peace in this era where conflicts have spiraled out of control? And in keeping with what President Hess said about the canoe, my invitation to you today is to take your canoes and canoes of peace and to move forward in peaceful ways. That is the true test of this pudding. Political dialogues in our time have become vitriolic beyond belief. Guns are used to address differences. We see the United States engaged in 3 wars. We witness the racial, ethnic, and economic polarization and hatred in, for example, Arizona, where I come from and where I live. We witness political conflicts whose discourses are disrespectful and violent. The violence also includes social injustice. For example, 1 in 6 Americans struggle with hunger. The proportion of United States households defined as food insecure with income at or below the federal poverty threshold is 40%. Conflict can be the product of many things: cultural differences, political differences, poverty, inequality in general. Conflict is also in our homes, between partners, between siblings, on the school playground. Around the world, 1 in 3 women has been physically assaulted. Conflict is triggered by disrespected differences of many different kinds, differences of race, of gender, of class, of sexuality, religion, politics, or culture. It is my view that all of these conflicts and forms of conflict are interrelated and they spiral together, but that's a whole other topic. That's a topic for you to research. I want to add that from my own Native American perspective, conflict is not merely a category that involves humans. Environmental degradation, for example, or greenhouse gases also bespeak of conflict between humans and Mother Earth. I consider that nothing is more important than to move away from all of these interrelated conflicts and toward a harmonious future. What is at stake? Well, our future is at stake. The planet and everything on it shares one future because we are all one. We are all interconnected in the circle of life. We share one planet. The oceans and the winds interconnect as they flow. We are also today connected by technologies that make a global communication instantaneous, but they also have a price. Technology gives us a global picture and a global threat. War, even 100 years ago, was not a threat to the continuation of life on the planet. But now we have nuclear wars, biological wars, and chemical weapons threatening the entire circle of life. Historically, our ability to control and understand our technology has not kept pace with its destructive potential. Japan's nuclear meltdown belongs to all of us, particularly in this era of technologies that we do not control, such as nuclear. Disaster for one is disaster for all. Our future is truly one future. We cannot afford to be only individuals looking out for our individual selves. The Native American idea of the 7 generations, you might have heard this term of the 7 generations, presents us with a tool, not just a philosophy, but a true blueprint of survival. The concept and practice of the 7 generations summons us, invites us to measure all our decisions, words, and actions by their effects, good or bad, for 7 generations to come. At the heart of my talk today are the peaceways that enable this harmonious convergence, and I want to go over some of those peaceways or teachings that are available to us. And my 19-year-old daughter said, "Oh, Mom, you can't teach people about peace in half an hour or 40 minutes. And I said, well, that's true, but I can plant a few seeds. And so that's what I'm doing today. I'm sowing a few seeds with regard to peace and how to make peace and what are the peaceways that others before us have left for our benefit. There is no shortage of peaceways, and what I'm going to do is name 7 of them, but I'm going to focus particularly on one of the more manageable of these peaceways. And the ones that I want to name are, first of all of the Earth's spiritual and philosophical traditions. A second one is what I call the traditional wisdom or knowledges of our mothers and grandmothers. The third one is what is commonly called peace studies. A fourth one is called nonviolent techniques of communication. A fifth one is called social justice movements, given that injustice breeds violence. Am I on the sixth one? Sixth one would be nonviolent action, which is peacemaking on a broader scale. A further one is known as truth and reconciliation movements. You might have heard of those. And so I'm going to go and tell you a little bit about each of these, but then I'm going to focus primarily on something called cultural competence. And it's usually called cultural competence for short, but I like to call it multicultural proficiency, multicultural proficiency. But before I talk about cultural competence or multicultural proficiency, I'm going to give you a sense of what, of what the other peaceways involve, and I'm sure you've heard of some of these ways. So I started by mentioning all of the Earth's spiritual traditions being at their core, at their innermost core, peaceways. All of the Earth's spiritual traditions summon us to love one another, to be kind and compassionate to all, especially to those we consider our enemies. Entire teachings focus on peace as one of the greatest and most fundamental goals. For example, the word Islam comes from the root word salam, meaning peace. Or we can remember Augustine of Alexandria's words. This is the Saint Augustine in his writings on Christian doctrine tells us something about harmonious convergence. Quote, "Love itself, which binds men together in the bond of unity, would have no means of pouring soul into soul and mingling them with one another if men and women never learned anything from their fellow men. So here already the summons of love is about learning from others. Or looking at one of the Buddha's general ethical principles stated in the Dhammapada, quote, "Never in this world is hostility appeased by hostility. It is appeased by lack of hostility," end quote. Native American spiritual traditions also offer many kinds of peaceways. Among the indigenous tools that signal harmonious convergence are the 4 sacred colors, which, as far as I have been able to determine, unite all the tribes from Alaska to the tip of South America. And that is the unity of the 4 colors, the sacred colors, red, brown, white, and yellow. These 4 are always adjacent in the life circle, signaling the unity of all cultures. There are other Native American philosophical and ceremonial traditions that teach us about unity and the importance of harmonious connection or harmonious convergence. When we say, for example, "all my relations," which is often used to end a prayer, it is to assert the relationship between all living entities, be they human, plant, stone, mountains, ancestors, the planets, the air, the oceans, everything. All of that is our relations. And in the Native American songs, we honor all of life, the deer, the eagle, the dolphin, and more. Native America also has ritualizations of aggression that prevent violence. Now, aggression is part of life. You know, we all get mad and we all engage in conflict, but we have to find the ways out of that, the way to further process that aggression and that conflict. And so, for example, the game of lacrosse, which I think is more popular here than in Arizona, in its origins, was a ritualization of violence. It was a way to dissipate the violent energies among the young men or whoever played it or plays it. Some California tribes, for example, ritualize conflict and work with that energy of aggression by having opposing parties throw rocks across rivers at one another, not with the intention of hitting one another. These activities, in fact, they harness the aggressive energy, they acknowledge it, harness it, and redirect it into a nonviolent activity. So these are techniques with which to dissipate violence and conflict. We have teachings, abundant teachings, such as the Mayan concept of In Lakesh. In Lakesh means you are my other self, and it is a short way to say that we are one and the same. If I hurt you, I hurt myself. If I do good for you, I do good for myself. So there is that interconnection and that harmonious convergence in this term. There are, moving on out of the spiritual traditions, I want to mention something that rarely gets mentioned, which I referenced at the beginning, and that's the traditional wisdom of our mothers. Cesar Chavez, the civil rights leader, Cesar Chavez, used to always say that his nonviolent training came from his mother and his grandmother before he ever heard of Gandhi or Martin Luther King, that the training, the nonviolent training was in his household with the sayings, the dichos of his mother and grandmother. In my own family, and we always quote Mama Kari, and Mama Kari, who died a long time ago, but her words live on and are spoken in chorus whenever young men want to fight one another, which in my family seems to be happening quite often. So when young men start to strut and put up their fists, everyone cries out, "Los pleitos ni ganados ni perdidos son buenos." Fights, be they lost or won, are no good. So this chorus of admonition to those who want to engage in fighting is there. These sayings point us to conflict resolution techniques that do not harm others. And we have an abundant number of sayings. One of them is in many of the families, and I translate it, and it translates into, "Better he ran from here than he died right here." That's one of the sayings. In other words, it's better to run away from a violent context than to engage in conflict. It sort of gives you the permission to run away from a fight. And then one of my favorite ones seems very simple, but I want to mention it. Hablando se entiende la gente. It's, by talking, we come to understand one another. And that might seem really banal or simple, but in fact, often we turn our backs on a conflict or on somebody who we think has aggrieved us. But the really hard part is to not turn your back, but to talk it out, talk it out, talk it out, and to make harmonious convergence with our words. So we have an abundance of these sayings that teach us about how to reestablish peace or harmony. More recently, in the past 40 years, 50 years, a discipline at universities has been established called peace studies. And it's an interdisciplinary discipline of study whose goals are to understand the causes of armed conflict, to develop ways to prevent and resolve war, genocide, terrorism, gross violations of human rights, and to build peaceful and just systems and societies. So this is a way at university where we can engage in dialogues or learning or studying about peace. And the University of New Mexico has a peace studies department, and also the University of Notre Dame. And I just want to point you in that direction in case you're wondering what to do for your master's degrees or PhD degrees. You can go there and learn to become a peacemaker. One of the other techniques I mentioned initially, and I just want to bring it up again, is nonviolent communication. And these are techniques focused on the nitty-gritty of how we speak to one another in our daily lives. We can learn through nonviolent communication to transform our communications toward mindfulness. Just in the last week, in fact, I was studying some nonviolent communication because I was trying to teach myself how to ask my 19-year-old daughter to clean her room and pick up all her clothes and put them away in a non-violent way. And I discovered by reading that I had been telling her this in a way that was aggressive and violent. So you can see that even in the nitty-gritty of our daily interactions with loved ones, we have a lot to learn. So the other peace way that I mentioned initially is social justice movements, and there are many kinds of social justice movements, and they seek to create institutions and societies that function by principles of equality and human rights. And equality can be defined as a state of nonviolence or peace or peaceful convergence. So this is really a broad topic, and I'm trying to show you how it can be in so many parts of our lives. One of the peace ways or techniques or teachings of peace that you might have heard more about is the political nonviolent action. And political nonviolent action has been very prominent in the 20th century, particularly within decolonizing movements, but also within the civil rights movements of the United States. One of the among the well-known practitioners of this political nonviolent action are Mohandas K. Gandhi, Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers, Dr. Martin Luther King. And nonviolent action is always spiritually anchored, so it's very much related to those spiritual traditions that I mentioned initially. Here are Martin Luther King's words, quote, "Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence. Man must evolve for all human conflict, a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation for such method is love." Martin Luther King's nonviolent actions were crucial in ending some of the most violent forms of racial and political conflict in the United States. King learned from his Southern Baptist Church teachings and also from Mahatma Gandhi, whose political nonviolence brought an end to British rule in India. Gandhi and his nonviolent movement essentially convinced the British colonizers to leave India. It is important to stress that love as nonviolence is not a passive virtue, but a political activity and social activity, a commitment and a sustained activity in this world. In the words of Gandhi, he reminds us of this need for sustained activity. Quote, without a direct action, expression of it, without a direct action expression of it, nonviolence to my mind is meaningless. So you can't just think nonviolence, you have to act nonviolence, put it into action. You might have heard, moving on, I want to tell you a little bit about truth and reconciliation processes. You might have heard of this in conjunction with South Africa after apartheid. Truth and reconciliation processes usually set up in places emerging from long periods of violent relations, be they genocide, civil war, or dictatorship. As in South Africa, a commission is charged with gathering testimony concerning wrongdoing from both victims and perpetrators. So there's that whole peace way that one can undertake. My main focus today is about what I call, or what is generally called, cultural competence. There are many ways to name it. I'm going to give it all kinds of names. Cultural competence. We can call it leaving ethnocentrism. Leaving ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is where you move about in the world with the idea that everything circles around your own culture. So how do we become bridges to other cultures? How do we go about living diversity, embracing diversity? How do we grow in what I like to call multicultural proficiency? Multicultural proficiency. You can also call it diversity competence. It is all of these diversity competence that moves us toward harmonious convergence. So what is cultural proficiency? It is the acquired ability to interact respectfully with persons and groups different from your own, be they from various cultural backgrounds or of a different age or of a different gender. A basic thought of this cultural proficiency is that no one culture or group is the universal yardstick. What is culture? I'm going to give you a brief definition of culture just so that we're moving together here. A culture is a collective of values, norms, gender roles, language, spiritual practices, forms of social organization, musics, dance, cuisine, conventions of dress, and connection to regions. Culture is the unspoken lens, the attitudes, expectations, and assumptions with which we approach everything. Culture is all the things that connect you to a group which shares those human elements. In this time, in this era, we all need to stretch and become part of many different cultures, of many different groups. Multicultural proficiency or cultural competence allows you to function cross-culturally and thus avoid cultural conflict. In today's world, multicultural proficiency is a requirement for harmonious convergence. It prepares you to have an understanding and appreciation for differences between cultures and within cultures. Cultural competence is a set of interpersonal skills that can be acquired, or you can also shed some not so good skills that you've acquired. So how do we acquire or develop cultural competence or cultural proficiency that creates convergence? Generally speaking, there are 4 different ways in which we move into this cultural competence. And usually you're moving in all 4 of those areas at the same time, but I'm going to break it down into 4 of them, and so that you can see one at a time. These 4 essential elements that contribute to becoming culturally proficient. Number 1, value diversity among peoples. Love the human family in all of its varieties and differences. For example, be happy and not suspicious when you hear people speaking a language you don't understand. Don't defensively assume that they're talking about you or that they don't belong here or anything like that. And I can give you examples from just the airport yesterday. I sat down, pulled up a cell phone and was talking in Spanish on the cell phone. I could feel the discomfort from the people sitting. There was a seat here where they had put their hand baggage, and then people were seated there. And they became very uncomfortable. And not only that, but they removed all of their stuff from next to me. And I felt like, you know, because I was speaking this strange language, I was either assumed to be a thief, dangerous, what have you. The hand luggage was quickly positioned in another place. And it was sort of funny, but this is an example of not valuing diversity, of feeling that difference is a threat, you know, that something is wrong. And so the first one is not, the first element of developing cultural proficiency is to start to welcome different cultural systems, to open your hearts, open your minds to difference, to be accepting of difference. And in that vein, of course, we can't advocate for the English-only laws that are sweeping the nation. So moving beyond valuing diversity among peoples, moving to a second step. The second step is developing the capacity for cultural self-assessment or self-reflection concerning our own cultural attitudes. Who am I? How do I think about things? How do I feel when somebody is doing something that I've never seen people do or something I don't understand? Such awareness implies a consciousness, excuse me, a consciousness of one's personal reactions to people who are different. For example, a police officer who recognizes that he profiles people who look like they are from Mexico as so-called illegal aliens has cultural awareness of his reactions to this group of people. We can all evolve in our reflections concerning our system of interaction with others. Examine your reactions when you encounter someone with a different accent, with a different skin color, with different clothing. What informs your reaction? Why are you reacting the way you do? These are important questions. We need to pose them. We need to self-examine. How does each of us react to difference? What is the nature of our comfort zones, each of us? This all involves raising our awareness of cultural differences, biases, and stereotypes. I should point out that there are entire organizations and systems in place to help us hone our skills. For example, Georgetown University has a national center for cultural competence. And nowadays, it's a lot easier to tap into the resources that are there. And at Georgetown University's center, they actually teach this, for example, cultural assessment. They teach people to walk through the steps of understanding, you know, what makes you tick, of going through that process of self-discovery. And so if you want to know more, you can go there. A third element of cultural proficiency, excuse me while I have a sip of water. The third element of towards multicultural proficiency or cultural competence involves the actual study and acquisition, the activity of multicultural learning, of acquiring multicultural knowledges, becoming multiculturally proficient. This applies, this proficiency, this kind of sensitivity applies to individuals and institutions. We are called upon to develop a love for what we don't understand, languages, peoples, customs, celebrations, spiritual systems, and we're called upon to cultivate that spirit of inquiry, looking into what is different. We are called upon to suspend our own frame of reference. First of all, I had been talking about understanding our own frame of reference, and now you have to actually suspend it as we learn more about another culture's frame of reference and their practices. Approach what is different with care and respect and with love. Withhold judgment. One of the most common things is, and even little kids do this, you know, they see something at school, somebody brings a burrito or something they haven't seen, and how do they react? If it's unseen, unknown, it's usually, ooh, you know, it's like, what's that? And the what's that has to be a moment of joy and not a moment of ooh. So that's what I'm talking about here. The more you learn about a new culture, the better you will understand your own cultural characteristics. As you study another culture actively, you learn to see your own culture better. And here I'm talking about how these 4 points that I'm presenting are all interrelated. The contrast to your own culture becomes clear, as does the common ground. I was mentioning that earlier that I spent 12 years in Germany as a student, and I got my doctorate in German studies. And one of the most amazing things about going into a culture that was not mine in that depth was learning to see my own culture better. It brought my own culture into an incredibly sharp profile. And the other thing it did is, as the more you learn about another culture, the less you are able to generalize about it. You know, I found people who spent 1 week in Germany, they already knew the Germans are this and the Germans are that and the Germans are funny because of, and I found that with every year I spent there, I was less able to make a generalization that, you know, make blanket statements about a whole culture. So that's all part of learning another culture, is you're learning about yourself at the same time. And finally, the fourth element of multicultural proficiency has to do with applying new cultural skills. And that's like the sailboat analogy again. It's not just theoretical and you learned it in a book, but applying new cultural skills. We all need to develop or put in place cultural or behavioral adaptations that reflect an understanding of cultural diversity. It isn't enough to just have thought the thought, but you have to walk the thought. You have to show that you are respectful and understanding of a world of multicultures. At the institutional level, we need to institutionalize varied cultural knowledges. In other words, this is not just an individual undertaking. This is about making institutions, this one and all other ones, multicultural. In the world in general, we need to challenge monoculturalism that manifests as cultural bias and religious or political dogmatism and violence. And here I can give you another example from my own family. My partner, whenever he's made a practice throughout his life of learning as many greetings in as many languages as possible. And we walk into a Chinese restaurant, he greets everyone in Chinese, Mandarin, and different languages. The Japanese restaurants, he's able to speak, greet people in Japanese, say thank you in Japanese, say goodbye. And that's a start. And I have to tell you, when I first met up with him and saw him doing this, I thought, how curious that he would do this. And now I understand, you know, how wise, how good making a better world. And as in preparing for my talk here, I asked him, I said, well, why do you do that? And this was his answer. He said, that way, quote, that way I recognize their presence in the universe. Wow. That way I recognize their presence in the universe. And that's what it is. It's about recognizing this presence in the universe, all of the beautiful cultural systems that surround us. And so this fourth element is about needing to ponder techniques to recognize other cultural systems. We need to develop ways to be other than ourselves. We need to learn as many languages as possible. We need to study other cultures. We need to travel and understand the different spirits that are in different parts of the national geography and international geographies, and learn to sail in those waters. So these four elements that I have just described, they all happen at the same time. And all of these elements need to manifest at every level of our functioning, which is the individual level, organizational levels, including policy making, administrative levels, and at the state and national level. Furthermore, these elements of developing cultural proficiency should be reflected in the attitudes, structures, policies, and services of individuals and organizations in their service delivery to individuals, families, and communities. For example, physicians and others in the healthcare delivery system benefit from medical personnel's awareness and sensitivity toward diverse patient populations. After all, health behaviors are culturally influenced. And I learned that in Germany. When I went to Germany, there were illnesses that I had never heard of. And by the same token, in my culture, there are illnesses that are really culturally based that don't exist in any other culture. If you can believe that, it's true. And so if you're going to be a physician, you need to understand that different cultures even define illness differently and approach it differently. The University of Connecticut Health Center's website tells us, quote, diversity is an organizational way of life. Diversity is an organizational way of life where men and women who differ in a multitude of ways work and learn in an environment of mutual respect and appreciation. Diversity also taps innovation and creativity by encouraging everyone to be an active member in a multicultural environment that encourages self-assessment, growth, and improvement, end quote. Among the places that really need to do this, to do training in multicultural proficiency are the schools. And some of the teachers that I have encountered can greatly benefit from diversity training because cultural incompetence, xenophobia, and cultural chauvinism are there. And I give you the example of my daughter when she was in 10th grade. One of her school teachers said this, and I wrote it down and I pulled it out for this. The teacher said, quote, "That's why Mexicans are poor. They steal from each other." End quote. So my daughter stood up and said, "What you just said is racist, and I want you to take it back." And the teacher scoffed at her, and my daughter ran to the principal's office and demanded an apology. And the teacher stood by her remarks, and the principal did nothing. So obviously that school, and this school, by the way, is considered one of the 20 best high schools in the nation, and I will name it here, it's called University High School, is greatly in need of cultural competence training, diversity training, including what is known as anti-racism training. Cultural competence training, actually without anti-racism training, will always fall short. Some final thoughts on the peaceways or teachings of cultural competence or harmonious convergence. And I love the convergence word, thank you. And I love the this as a topic for this. And I want to add some things to what I just said. Number one, it takes a commitment to questioning. It takes a commitment to learning and to expanding your own identity. Number two, what I'm talking about is a developmental process that takes a lifetime. And most of you here are undergraduates and have many years ahead of you where you can actually commit to this development process. At any part of your life, you can commit to this developmental process that takes us all toward peace. Number three, ideally, all of this begins with childhood. All of this begins with childhood. And you know, the example of how do I ask a child to clean the room in a way that is nonviolent already sets that child in motion to adopt some of that nonviolence, some of that harmonious convergence. Gandhi's words are relevant here. Quote, if we are to teach real peace in this world, and if we are to carry on a real war against war, we shall have to begin with the children, end quote. Number four, these peaceways will touch everything in your life, your home life, your extended family, your neighborhood, your city, your nation, all nations. Number five, what I'm talking about here can be learned and practiced. It isn't anything out of this world. It can be learned, it can be practiced. Number six, inequality, conflict. Inequality is a form of conflict, and hence social justice movements in theory seek peace, and in actions create that convergence. Faced with the current realities of global conflict, which in my estimation have reached new levels and intensity both in these United States and globally, we are all called upon to either passively accept the escalating conflicts or to actively dedicate ourselves to alternatives. In conclusion, let's leave our comfort zone. Let's become the change we want to see in the world. Let us become multicultural citizens of the world and build bridges of consensus, understanding, and of convergence. We can cultivate diversity right here where we stand, right here where we sit. Harmonious convergence, however, requires that we leave our comfort zones and actively embrace difference, like we embrace and cultivate the different plants of one garden, the different faces of one humanity. Change begins with each of us. Thank you very much.
More friendly. Welcome to the panel discussion. I'm hoping that that little incident wasn't a comment on our panel. My name is Bruno Hicks. I'm a professor of environmental and science education, and I'm going to be the moderator for the panel discussion. For those of you who may just joined us, I'm going to take a few minutes and introduce our speakers. They're actually going to sit in the crowd and listen and watch the presentations. So they'll be coming up to speak, and when the presentations are all done, they'll come up and sit at the seats and they'll take any questions. So we're going to wait for questions till everything is done. Okay? Lise Pelletier is a graduate teaching assistant in sociology from the University of Kansas. He's originally from the former Yugoslavia. He spent almost 3 years in the besieged city of Sarajevo. He's worked for the International Rescue Committee, and him and his wife were refugees. They came to San Francisco. He's currently, he has a law degree from the University of Sarajevo, and he's working on a doctorate degree at the University of Kansas Lawrence. Dr. Yolanda Gonzalez is a professor of Mexican American Studies at the University of Arizona. She has been a professor of Chicano Studies and German Studies at the University of California. She studied at universities in Germany. She was the first undergraduate to attend the University of Arizona and graduate Phi Beta Kappa. She's broken several barriers as a woman in education, including receiving her doctorate from Stanford. Lise Pelletier, who is the director of the Acadian Archives. She was born in Fort Kent, grew up in Clare. She's an Acadian. She studies Acadian history and Acadian literature, and she's worked on her doctoral studies at the University of Maine at Orono. And they're going to basically give 3 presentations. The presentations will run roughly about 20 minutes. And like I said, when they're done their presentations, they'll all come back up here and sit, and then we'll take questions. So, Euros, would you like to start, please?
Thank you, Bruno. I really appreciate it. I would like to say thank you to all of you in the audience, and really want to thank you, Dr. Cardens, for inviting me to this presentation. It's been a blast. I've enjoyed the food here, getting to know some people, staying in a local hotel, learning what number 0 means, and getting a really great historical lesson there. Now, I want to make one point very clear before I start. Given that this topic has to do with culture, and given that we have roughly, I would like to remind you that different cultures have very different perceptions of what time is. Time is a very fluid category, and what 20 minutes might mean to you, it might not mean to me. Particularly if I'm to even attempt to address issues so horrific, such as genocide. Now, having said that, I wish that I could deal with some other subjects, but I think that massive killings, genocide, ethnic cleansing, although, by the way, I seriously object to that term because there is nothing clean about ethnic cleansing, but we can leave that later on. Unfortunately, are phenomena that are so frequent in our current histories that we cannot avoid it. As we speak, more than 100 ethnic conflicts are going on throughout the world. As we speak, hundreds of people around the world will be killed due to different ethnic conflicts. Now, what is that gives genocide as a phenomenon some type of common denominator? Let's just look at the 20th century mass killings or genocides. We can start with what took place in Germany. We can talk about Cambodia. We can talk about Bangladesh. We can talk about Indonesia. We can talk about former Yugoslavia. We can talk about Kosovo. We can talk about a variety of different countries worldwide. I would argue that there are 4 basic components that are common to each and every of these horrific acts throughout our history. The first one is the assumption of the pure race, be it ethnicity, nationality, or religion. I called it pure race. The second one is the notion of agroculturalism, and I will explain that concept later on. In short, it gives this pastoral, almost romanticized approach to the landscape, which is always populated by our ethnicity or our national group. It also gives the premise to the peasantry that lives on this land that eventually can become cadre of soldiers that are recruited to go into the national wars. It has to do also with the sense of antiquity. We'll talk about that, particularly for the Serbian case. And finally, it has to do with the notion of territoriality and excluding the ethnic, racial, religious, or national other from our demarcated territorial possessions. The picture that you can see here reflects what used to be former Yugoslavia. Allow me just very briefly, maybe for 5 minutes, to give you a brief overview of, as Glenn Misha, one of the foremost prominent scholars in the study of former Yugoslavia and the Balkans, calls what was twice a country called Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was formed in 1919, immediately after the World War I, at the auspices, as it were, of former empires, namely Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. The US president at the time played a crucial role in forming new states that started emerging throughout Europe and in some African countries, although considerably less frequently. In 1929, and by the way, important thing that I had forgotten, at the time, the country was called the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, with the monarch who was an ethnic Serb. In 1929, the country changes its name to Kingdom of Yugoslavia in order to emphasize the South Slavic roots, as it were, of the people who lived there, excluding people who are Albanians or of Albanian origin that are not ethnic, that are not Slavs. Pardon, I'm pointing to Albania, I mean Kosovo right here. So in 1929, that is what happens. Yugoslavia also stands for or means the land of the South Slavs. The idea of that Yugoslavia was to break it down to the elements of cross-cultural ethnic groups. It's a term which is very familiar to some European scholars, and it's slightly equivalent to the term multiculturalism that we use in the United States. By 1941, the ethnic tensions, primarily between the Serbs and the Croats in the area, entire former Yugoslavia, are really intensifying. During the World War II, Croatia is forming as a puppet Nazi state that is systematically trying to deport, kill, and convert primarily Orthodox Serbs. Numbers vary, but between 350,000 and 900,000 Serbs, mostly Serbs, died during the World War II within the so-called independent state of Croatia. November 29, 1943, President Tito, who was the leader of the socialist/communist movement that was embodied in the resistance group called Partisans, is forming what later on became as the socialist Yugoslavia. Socialist Yugoslavia, in the territorial borders that you can see in this picture, existed from 1945 until 1991. During this period, number of structural changes took place that, one way or the other, precipitated what was to start happening in 1991 wars that erupted, starting with Slovenia and then moved to Croatia, Bosnia, and in 1999, Kosovo, Serbian province of Kosovo, or Kosovo Republic, as it is known since February 28th of 2008. 1950s were quite interesting in Yugoslavia, where so-called self-management, workers' self-management, was promulgated quite intensely in order to, one way or the other, reconcile different national and ethnic groups. Starting with 1970s, number of different ethnicities and nationalities started revising their communist nationalist ideologies. One of the things that President Tito at the time did was to de facto keep the national minorities within the territories of the republics. So for example, in Serbia, we had more than 65% of the Serbs living in Serbia proper. The only republic that was different was Bosnia and Herzegovina in the middle, that did not have an ethnic or national majority. Once Tito died in 1980, the entire movement of nationalizing spaces, and I will describe that term in a second, started re-emerging through mostly communist political leaders who took off the hats of communists and put on the hats of nationalists in the worst possible sense of that word. Before I move into some more detailed explanation, I just wanted to show you two pictures of Bosnia and Herzegovina that has had but the worst experience of ethnic genocide, or as I call it, genocidal massacre during the war from 1992 to 1995. This picture here represents Bosnia before 1991, and this picture here represents Bosnia and Herzegovina after 1995. As you can see, the ethnic territories, the red being the territories controlled by the Serbs, the blue territories controlled by the Croats, and the green territories controlled by the Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims, have been entirely changed on many different levels. What happened as a result of genocide that took place in the former Yugoslavia was more than 250,000 people who died. More than 70% of those 250,000 people who died were civilians. According to the United Nations reports, that are very conservative, more than 35,000 women in the former Yugoslavia were brutally raped. More than 50% of those were killed in the most brutal way after they were raped. Only in Sarajevo City, where I had spent 3 years during the war, close to 10,000 people died between 1992 and 1995, when a famous so-called Dayton Agreement was signed and put in action. Now, the word that I will be using quite often is nationalized. Please notice that I'm using this word as a verb as opposed to noun. I want to emphasize that nationalizing has three categories. One, it is a practice. And by practice, I mean following the Brubaker from UCLA. I primarily refer to this notion that we go and practice our national identity, as opposed to that national identity being something that we simply carry with ourselves. Secondly, is this notion of national performativity, if you will. We're nationalizing the space in which we live. The same way that gender hegemony functions in a way that women wake up in the morning and put makeup without really realizing that that's the everydayness of the primarily masculine hegemony that is put upon them. Nationalizing hegemony really performs itself through people who go in the spaces and are proud to be Serb, Croats, Afghani, Americans, you name it. And lastly, traditional term of nationalizing, which refers to a state of being, to this hegemonic way of understanding what my nation is. And by hegemonic, I mean not oppressive in a way that is open, but something that we accept as norms. I will use nationalizing quite often as I'm trying to explain some of the components here. Now, who are the main protagonists, if you will, in the Yugoslav tragedies? The first, of course, are nationalizing elites. But I would like to warn you. Is this my warning? Do I have 5 more minutes? Okay. That's what I meant by time is very fluid, okay? So bear with me. Nationalizing political elites. Those are the elites that came from each and every of the republics. But let us not look at this problem one-dimensionally. I want to look at the elites from many different angles and to put them in the context of the former Yugoslavia. The second 2 groups are local groups that are nationalizing the space, and even local individuals that are nationalizing the space. The third group is international community, that from structural reasons that I don't have time to get into, played an enormous role in the tragedies of the former Yugoslavia, and I hope that at least one of you might ask that question so I can elaborate on that. And finally, there's this conglomerate, if you will, of structural and cultural forces that have created this myth of nationalizing history that often gets to be translated as circle of violence. For those of you who, of course, are more familiar with the American phenomena, I would compare this circle of violence to what many of us in sociology critique when we hear the word circle of poverty, in which poor people are simply poor because they choose to be poor. The same analogy can be applied here where, well, people from the Balkans engage in genocide simply because they engage in genocide, that they're predisposed to engage in genocide. I'm not going to deal with all of them, but let me just deal with nationalizing political elites. What are the factors? Power that lead to violence. Power, inherited ideology of territoriality, protection or creation of existing state, and historical and collective memories. Power, how does it function? In Yugoslavia, and let's deal just with the Serbian case, the demise of the socialist regimes worldwide created this potentiality for something new because there were no other alternatives. There was no civil life, as it were, recognized in the Western world. The only other potentiality was the nationalistic one. What did the nationalists, including Milosevic, that I'm sure at least some of you have heard of, what did he do? He legitimized that nationalism over the entire political space of the former Yugoslavia. How did he do that? Well, he used his political nomenclature, basically oligarchy, that he controlled, but that was not enough. That would be a very simplistic understanding of the problem. He used so-called apparatchiks. I'm sorry for this word, I really like it, so I had to find a way to put it in. I like it because it describes, as Foucault would address, these small fish, if you will, who can really make our lives miserable. Those small bureaucrats that can make us suffer as we're looking to get a driver's license. Now, he's nationalizing them as well. The third component is Milosevic had to continue this cult of being a leader, the same way that Tito was a leader. That's the only way to keep subjugated people in a particular way, especially if they're diverse, if you will. Protection of the privileges. Of course, I don't want to give up what is already there for me, and if communism is not going to cut it anymore, I better put some other hat in order to protect my privileges. And finally, if international community is not going to recognize my state as a federative state, I better create Serbia, in this case, as a very strong state. The pretty similar scenario, with some differences, applies also to Croatia to a certain extent. Let's deal with the second element, which is more cultural in nature as opposed to structural. Deals with the territories. Historically, we have had, in that part of the world, unresolved territorial disputes. And by the way, this is not Yugoslav phenomenon. This is not the phenomenon from the Balkans. This is the phenomenon that primarily started emerging in the Western Europe, in the civilized part of the world, much, much earlier than anywhere else in the world. Because those territories are contested, what happens is that different nations who are being nationalized and think of themselves only as nations start thinking of making claims on the territories that might or might not be theirs. Thus, the unsuccessful claim on those territories. Once they recognize that they cannot resolve the problems, they try to be civilized. How are they being civilized? By trying to negotiate. Thus, the datum in 1995, when de facto 3 war criminals tried to negotiate the peace for the people of the former Yugoslavia. Because those attempts to negotiate territory either fail or are based on the genocidal principles, they produce new conflict over the territory, and ad infinitum from there on. If this is what is meant by cycle of violence, then yes, there is such a thing as cycle of violence in the former Yugoslavia, or in Indonesia, or in East Timor, or in Pakistan, if you will, or even right now in Afghanistan. But I would like you really to consider that these cycles of violence are often based on the structural predispositions, on the cultural predispositions that have nothing to do ultimately with the people themselves only. The third aspect is very interesting to the extent that it really puts before us this, pardon me using this word, dialectical relationship, mutual relationship among the actors. How does that mutual relationship play in the scene called Yugoslavia? Well, we first resist hegemonic other. In former Yugoslavia, who was hegemonic other? The Serbs. Let's resist them. That very same hegemonic other is resisting the minorities. Why? Well, when Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and Slovenia proclaimed independence in 1991, the Serbs, that used to be so-called constitutive people, a legal term, hopefully I'll be able to explain it later on, all of a sudden turned into political minority. So from being a dominant group, all of a sudden, they're finding themselves within their own groups in a position of being minority. So they actively resist that element. In addition, what is happening is that we have continuation of this nationalizing state that emphasizes nation and national identity as the primary identity as opposed to citizenship as an individual identity. These three put together create further preconditions for the open conflict to take place. Finally, clearly historical and cultural aspects. Bruno, how am I doing on time? 5 more minutes? Okay, 5 more minutes, Brazilian time, or okay. Is this entire notion of victimhood, imminent danger, and never again concept. Please allow me to illustrate this concept through the Serbian case. Victimhood sense is well documented in the studies on race and ethnicity, nationalism, as well as studies in genocide. 1389, for the Serbs, many Serbs, still unfortunately, and by the way, I come from a Serbian heritage, so I should have mentioned that, I suppose, at the beginning. 1389 has this crucial importance. That's the year of the battle, Kosovo battle, where the Serbs, according to the nationalizing past, stood still, chose to be the heavenly people, and chose to finally defend the Christendom from the invading Ottomans. And instead of being awarded by the rest of the Christendom, eventually 600 years later, they were punished for that. What Milosevic did was 600 years to the day after the Battle of Kosovo to gather at the same place that the battle took place in Kosovo in 1989, give a speech in front of more than 2 million Serbs and say that Kosovo will never, ever, ever again be anyone else's land but the Serbian land, because that is the cradle of the civilization. If that was it, it would not be enough. He said, I'm telling you this because I don't want the events of the World War II when the Serbs were slaughtered to repeat themselves. We finally have to protect our country. And if the Croats, if the Bosniaks do not want to live with us, well, at least we can protect ourselves. That is not enough as well. There's a sense of imminent danger. Let's vilify the other. Let's produce the sense of fear. Let's make sure that we're not only dealing with abstract fear, but imminent fear. Genocide that is just about to take place. Finally, what the military and the administration and the president are doing at that time, they're engaging in resisting genocide. How do they resist genocide? By militarizing their forces, by making sure that all available resources, including people who are brought from everywhere and elsewhere, are standing together as a national one. And finally, a very modern term that I'm using right here, with multiple meanings, I suppose, the idea of the preemptive strike as the only possible solution to prevent an imminent, impending genocide. Now, I would be completely inaccurate if I were to claim that it is only the political elite to be blamed. That's what I meant by nationalizing spaces. But I want to show you how ideological and power elites' ideologies and theories get to be translated among the common people. Look at the first one, unresolved territorial issue. How does that get to be translated among the populace? Danger for our side. Victimhood is victimhood. Fear of minority status, let's say among the Serbs, means let's fight for our current status. I would like to go to the never again concept that Milosevic and Tudjman emphasized quite often. Never again concept often was translated among the Serbs, the Croats, and many others as everything goes concept. If I'm to protect myself and my own survival, I better do whatever it takes, and whatever it takes, it's justifiable to a certain extent. Finally, war is unpredictable. Radovan Karadzic had in The Hague, and who went to Boston Parliament and said, hey, you Boston Muslims, you don't want to go into the war because war will mean complete destruction of your ethnic and national group. He's making this argument. How are the people hearing the argument? Well, we need to survive, and whatever our actions are, if the end is justified, the actions are okay. Which leads me to a very important point. The point that deals with this spatial time convergence, speaking of the culture, and how it played out in Yugoslavia, and I would dare to generalize in many other countries as well that have had experience of massive killing on this scale. Well, we have past, present, and future as continuing. But if that past, present, and future is seen in a way that the emphasis is on the past and the emphasis is on the future, present somehow does not exist. If present doesn't exist, not only legalistically, but culturally, there is no responsibility that is attached to the actions that take place in the present time. In other words, if I'm not responsible for what I'm doing in the present, then everything goes, and all of the actions are justified, particularly if they're seen as inevitable. Therefore, we're getting to actual acts of violence, where in the name of the past grievances, that by the way, quite often might be very realistic, the positions of the Serbs as a new minority in Croatia, the positions of the Serbs as a new minority in Bosnia and Herzegovina, never again principle, and so on. And for the sake of the better future in which finally we will have our state, for God's sake, the French, the English have had their states for so long, and we, the Serbs, have bled for hundreds of years, and this is what we get at the end. Therefore, whatever it takes to get to the point of creating the nation state is acceptable. As a result, there's almost a component of collective amnesia in which the genocide takes place without people even being cognizant that genocide is taking place. It is not simply other ethnic group, it is the vilified other who is being subjugated to what he or she, and I'm using these pronouns purposefully, is asking for. Now, what are the possible solutions? I will offer some of them, and I promise I will be very short, that are quite unpopular. There are two solutions, and before I do that, let me just tell you one thing which I think is really crucial. None of the reasons that the war in Bosnia had started for at the first place has been resolved as of yet. That is my biggest scare. In other words, the potentiality of a new genocide is as real as it has ever been. Therefore, I'm arguing for two things. One, before any country of the former Yugoslavia, with the exception of Slovenia, is to be accepted in the EU, they have to engage in a form of confederation. Why? It was Bosnia, and primarily Bosnian Muslims, that really have suffered the most. And it was the obligation and the duties of the Serbs and the Croats, mostly Serbian Republic and Croatian Republic, to reconcile and assure the territoriality of Bosnia. Secondly, in order for that to happen, all the nations have to be constituted nations within the new confederacy of former Yugoslavia. Now, that implies dismantling of the Republic of Srpska. Those of you who don't know, Bosnia and Herzegovina currently is divided into two entities, one called the Federation, which is the Muslim-Croat Union, and the other called Republic of Srpska, which is supposed to be multi-ethnic subdivision, but actually it's predominantly Serbian territory. Now, here's a concept that I will come back to later on because I don't have time now to explain. It's called forgive and forget doctrine. I'm sure you're familiar with forgive but not forget doctrine. I'm arguing something quite the opposite. Forgive and forget doctrine, if anything is to be resolved in that part of the world. Meantime, clear distinction between collective responsibility and collective guilt, which is essential if any country, any people are to meaningfully continue living together. And finally, something which I find very interesting, and that is going back to the demographic map of the 1991, which is non-existent anymore, and making each and every state within the region to have political representatives that correspond to the ethnic makeup before the war started. In other words, Sarajevo, for example, where I lived during the war, had more than 190,000 Serbs living in the city. Now, there are barely 10,000 Serbs. My argument here is Sarajevo has to have ethnic representations of 190,000 Serbs, if not those who live there, and at least those who are administratively represented there. In that way, willingly or not, people will have a political will in addition to simply cultural will. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Thank you to all the organizers. You've done a spectacular job, and thank you especially to Professor Soraya Cardenas, right there. This is a lot of work represented here, and I'm so impressed by our coming together. And I was very impressed by the student presentations on student research, and that they would be showcased here. I congratulate University of Maine at Fort Kent. I was really so happy with that. We have student research at the University of Arizona, but it's a lot more underground, and it doesn't get the main stage like here. So, yes, I'm coming from Arizona. I'm going to move over here because the light is in my eyes. And this morning, someone approached me and said, "Oh, Arizona, it's terrible where they passed that proposition." And you know, there's like dozens of propositions that have been passed that are oppressive, and Senate bills, and you name it. Right now, I think the governor has 110 bills on her desk from this session that's in recess now. She has to decide which one she's going to sign or not. But it's a real battering, all the laws that are being passed in Arizona. And that's why somebody as distinguished as Dr. Cornel West of Princeton University 2 weeks ago came to Arizona and spoke and said this. He said that Arizona is now the front line for the struggle of rights and liberties, ground zero for the struggle for justice in this nation. And it sounds that he has a spiritual way of converting ugly situations into something that sounds better. And so naming Arizona as the front line, it sounded good at the time. Everyone applauded, but it's actually talking about how polarized, racially polarized, politically polarized, economically polarized Arizona is. It's an environment saturated with violence, actually, against cultural and human diversity. And there's a basic disregard for human life that Urosh talk led me to remember that, in fact, this is a very old history, and in this territory there's a long history of genocide, and in fact my own family comes from a 20th century form of genocide where everyone on my grandmother's side, except for my grandmother as a baby, she was somehow saved in a genocide in Mexico, on the border actually. It was a genocide that both the United States and Mexico participated in. And it's these ongoing genocides. I see it as this long history of genocides against indigenous peoples that have actually made both the Mexican and the United States nation. And so this is but the newest, these are the newest chapters of that. So Cornel West's words speak to the fact that nowhere in these United States is injustice and the disregard for human life, liberty, worse than in Arizona, and that's what I want to talk about today. So this morning I spoke about peaceways, and my afternoon presentation is all about the kinds of conflicts that are doing so well, particularly. Okay, there's a picture missing. And it's an unfortunate, can someone tell me? Click it again. That's the next, yeah. And I'm going back and it won't go back, so. Okay, well I'm going to tell you what is in the picture which vanished. I have a really, technology and I are not on good terms with one another. And so what I brought a map actually, oh gosh, sorry about race relations have long roots in this part of the country. And in this map that is not visible, I show you Mexico in 1848. And Mexico in 1848 includes California, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and it's in this westward expansion of the emerging U.S. nation that the northern half of the Mexican nation gets eaten up through warfare. So I wish we had the map. Usually when students see this map of Mexico before 1848, they gasp, not having sense that very recently, as recently as my great-grandmother, where we live now, which is called Arizona, California, New Mexico, was Mexican land. And so what's happened is that the contemporary relations between whites and people of color in Mexico is, of course, has the roots in conquest and the fact of the victors arriving, taking the land, and this group of people has historically come to regard itself as higher beings, what we refer to as the nationalizing elites, bringing ideologies of territoriality. This is our territory now, and you who have been here for thousands and thousands of years are now and are to remain second-class citizens. And that's the situation that has been there for generations now in my family. And that's why we joke around and we say things like, we did not come to the United States came to us. Sort of to turn around this whole idea of you're all a bunch of immigrants and you shouldn't be here. So there was a treaty signed in 1848 between the United States and Mexico, and that treaty ended the war, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And although it ended the war between these two nations, and it guaranteed wonderful things, cultural rights, land rights to the existing native peoples and Mexicans, but that treaty, like all other treaties signed with the United States, has not been honored. So we have a situation that Professor Geraldo Cadava at Northwestern University describes in this way in his newly released book, quote, "The inclination of Arizonans to target Mexicans as the cause of their political and financial problems has shaped the state's history for at least a century." So that's a nutshell version of Arizona history of the last century. After 1848, there was, theoretically a border between the United States and Mexico, but it isn't until my generation that this border has been built up into a huge wall. Even in my parents' time, you just walked back and forth, and really there wasn't much of a problem. There was like a fluid border, and nowadays, and particularly since 1994, it has been gotten higher and higher and higher. And one of the first pictures I want to show you is this one. Here are the deer crossing the line. And this morning I talked about the fact that peace, it's coming off. I tell you, microphones are jumping away. That peace ways and ways of conflict are not only human-centric, they not only have to do with human beings. And here you see a picture of the border wall and of the destruction. Basically, the size of the wall breaks up the habitat for animals that need to migrate. And so the wall is not only a problematic for human beings, but it also brings with it the destruction of wildlife and ecosystems. They have dredged the desert and killed incredible plant life. It's a real tragic, it's an environmental tragedy as much as that includes human beings and all kinds of animals. Here is another shot of the wall, this border that has been built up in the last 15 years. And as you can see, it extends as far as the eye can see. Since 1994, the process of this is called border militarization, has been stepped up. The border fence and the concept of militarization has to do with the fact that it isn't just the border wall itself, but it also involves radar, sensors, cameras, patrol vans, helicopters, weapons, and detention centers where people trying to cross are often held for long periods of time. Crossers must fear the use of lethal force and border patrol abuses. In 2008, the group No More Deaths, No Más Muertes, released at a congressional briefing a report detailing systematic abuse of detainees by the U.S. Border Patrol. Those abuses range from denial of food and water to the denial of medical care to verbal and other physical abuse, and also the separation of family members. If a family is crossing, they might send the 3 different family members to 3 different, deport them to 3 different places and separate them in that way. Immigration law professor at the University of Arizona, Andy Silverman, tells us this, quote, "It was 60 years ago that the United Nations adopted and the United States entered into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 5 provides that, quote, no one shall be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Every day we hear from migrants of the cruel, inhuman, and degrading ways in which agents of our government have treated them." And I have one more border wall photo, and this one is in California, and the wall extends into the Pacific Ocean. And at the top, okay, sorry, technical moment here. At the top is a quote from Professor Wayne Cornelius in his testimony before the U.S. Commission for Civil Rights, stating that the U.S. border security policies, quote, have constituted the most obvious, the most acute, and the most systematic violation of human rights occurring on U.S. soil today. End of quote. Federal policy Operation Gatekeeper, and that's what this whole militarization of the last 15 years is called, Operation Gatekeeper, that began in 1994. Substituting for what should be comprehensive immigration reform. This particular policy is deadly because it forces border crossers or migrants to go into the worst parts of the desert and the mountainous areas where the likelihood of safe arrival is remote. And so it's like it funnels the militarization of the ancient passageways has forced people, funneled people into the worst parts of the desert, and it's created a real crisis. And I have a picture of one such border crosser, and it won't show up. It's a photo of a woman lying dead in the desert. The outcome of Operation Gatekeeper, which began in 1994, is that we have 5,000 women, men, and children dead, and so I put here that border militarization kills. Arizona has become a society that promotes violence and disrespects human life. Relevant international human rights law and principles tell us that national policies and actions must, quote, respect the human right to life, human integrity, and human dignity, and the border militarization is definitely disrespects the human right to life. Oh gosh, this is really magical. So all of my pictures are missing in action. Well, what if I put my jump drive with that? Wow. Sorry, folks. Try something else. Oh, thank you. How am I doing on time? Where's our timekeeper? stop the clock, please. Ah, PowerPoint. Oh. Oh. Don't try me right now. So, between the mic jumping away and the pictures not showing up. The next picture, which you can't see, pardon? Actually, I don't really like PowerPoint. I think it distracts from the speakers. You said let's take a break. We should have had everybody stand up and get some oxygen. But the topic of border militarization is actually, has been taken up by many groups, and among them, the tribal peoples of Arizona. It's what? Okay, went in, okay, so it went in this morning. Should I keep on talking or should we wait? Huh? Okay. So there's many tribes in Arizona. You might or might not know 30% of the Arizona land is actual Native American reservation land. And right on the border, actually across the length of the border at least, that one, main PowerPoint. Yeah. I want to just focus on one of the tribes, the Tohono O'odham tribe. The young people of the tribe, young people are often great visionaries, have organized into a group named O'odham Solidarity Across Borders. And we have to understand that the O'odham land is cut in half by the U.S.-Mexico border. Pardon? They are? The map, was the map up there or not? Okay, let's give up on, well, or we could just have a little bit of text here and there. Yes, so the O'odham tribe, has is a group of young people, but they work together with the elders. This morning, all sort of hung together, but okay, let's try this. O'odham Solidarity Across Borders, and I want to read you an elder statement that was released by them. Quote, "The development of the border wall has led to desecration of the Tohono O'odham ancestors' graves. It has divided communities and prevents O'odham from accessing sacred places. Troops and paramilitary law enforcement, detention camps, checkpoints, and citizenship verification are not a solution to issues of migration." Let me interrupt the elders for a moment and say that this business of citizenship verification, of people of color being targeted, it doesn't just affect recent crossers or people who are trying to cross. It affects me, it affects all of the people who've been there since time immemorial. All of us are suspects. All of us look like, they got, like, we have to show our papers. So it's a bizarre thing when the native peoples all come to be regarded as aliens. Quite a reversal. Anyway, continuing on with the elder statement, they continue on. "Indigenous peoples have existed here long before these imposed borders. Elders inform us that we always honored freedom of movement. Why are indigenous communities and the daily deaths at the border ignored? The impacts of border militarization are constantly made invisible in the media, the popular culture of this country, and even the mainstream immigrants' rights movement, which has often pushed for reform that means further militarization of the border, which means increased suffering for indigenous communities. Border militarization destroys indigenous communities. Since the creation of the current U.S.-Mexico border, 45 Tohono O'odham villages on or near the border have been completely depopulated. So there's a statement from the Tohono O'odham elders. And this group, by the way, just to give you a sense that there is a huge resistance to the inhumane border policies and this killer wall and abuses by the Border Patrol, that actually just a month ago, this group occupied the offices of the Border Patrol. And this morning I talked about nonviolent political action and occupying offices in a peaceful way, but nonetheless making issues visible in this way is a classic of political nonviolent action. Thank you. So when they occupied the Border Patrol office very recently, they said, quote, "We are pressing the attack against the ongoing colonization of our traditional lands. Environmental racism from transnational corporations and the state, and all colonial policies aimed at destroying our O'odham traditional way of life. We fight for self-determination and true sovereignty of our lands." And they had a whole list of demands that I will not read to you because I feel time breathing down my neck. See if the next picture comes. No, it isn't. This is one of the protests that have been held against what's happening at the border. And really, this is a mother. There are lots of mothers and children carrying signs affirming humanness. We are human. No group of people should have to proclaim their status as humans. This happens in dehumanizing political and economic environments. It is notable that the economic downturn in Arizona and across the nation is often blamed on undocumented workers. However, the majority view of economists is that the net effects of undocumented immigration, which is now predominantly Latino, are positive. And I brought with me the testimony of 5 or 6 economists, and even very conservative economists. For example, one thing published by Tamar Jacoby in the Conservative National Review, telling us that while individuals might receive, or undocumented individuals, commonly referred to as illegal aliens, might receive more in services than they paid in taxes, quote, they are growing the overall economic pie so significantly that the cost pales in comparison. Jacoby cited a recent study of immigrants in North Carolina that reported that over the prior 10 years, Latino immigrants had cost the state $61 million in a variety of benefits, but were responsible for more than $9 billion in state economic growth. And I have a bunch of studies that affirm the same thing. Another professor, Judith Gans, at the University of Arizona, found that immigrants contributed greatly to the state of Arizona through unclaimed state taxes that have kept the state afloat. Based on her research, the total state tax revenue from immigrant labor in 2004 was estimated at $2.4 billion. When she examined what was and is commonly debated as the focal points or issues of immigration drain, which is education, health, and law enforcement, she found that immigrants contribute an estimated $940 million towards state maintenance. At the national level, the U.S. Social Security Trust Fund reported a similar finding with a surplus of more than $49 billion just in the year 2000 from unclaimed or false Social Security numbers that border crossers typically use in order to obtain work. So this is, I brought with me several posters just to bring forward the point of undocumented immigrants being demonized, scapegoated, abused, and here's a semi-funny poster talking about, blame them for everything. Immigrants coming to take your jobs and wives, to destroy your way of life and spoil your kids, to give you diseases and create evil in general. And so this is also a work of art by Gabriel Gallardo, and it shows a portrait of Jesus. And you probably heard about this infamous Senate Bill 1070. How many of you have heard about it? It's made a lot of news. This Senate Bill 1070 mandates that law enforcement, that's police, regular police, should work as immigration officials if there is, quote, reasonable suspicion. If there is reasonable suspicion means, depending on how you look, of police, and that is racial profiling. Oh, you look like I should ask you for your papers. So it mandates that police act as border patrol agents. And here is a response by artist Gallardo: love thy neighbor as thyself, but only if thy neighbor is a U.S. citizen or resident alien. And this was actually on the eve of Governor Brewer signing Senate Bill 1070 into law. It did provoke nationwide protests. It provoked a boycott of Arizona, and also the federal government has now a lawsuit against Arizona because of Senate Bill 1070. President Obama requested that the Justice Department review the legality of this bill and alluded to its creators as irresponsible. He deplored the efforts of the Arizona legislature as threatening, quote, to undermine basic notions of fairness that we cherish as Americans, as well as the trust between police and their communities that is so crucial to keeping us safe. So, in fact, that critique by President Obama in July of 2010 led to the State Department suing Arizona, saying that Senate Bill 1070 unconstitutionally interferes with the federal government's authority to set and enforce immigration policy, explaining that, quote, the Constitution and federal law do not permit the development of a patchwork of state and local immigration policies throughout the country, and that Arizona, quote, crossed a constitutional line. But I think that's part of the Arizona strategy, is to undo the Constitution, because after this bill, they keep passing bills that defy the rights, the protections of the Constitution, and I think what they hope to put in place is lawsuits that then go to the Supreme Court and the Constitution gets revised. So here's another protest. Arizona Stop Senate Bill 1070. This particular poster mentions, in fact, the reality of the criminalization of communities, which I was indicating that people of color in general become racially profiled and suspect. Now, I mentioned that there is a huge boycott of Arizona happening as a result of 1070, and this is a who's boycotting Arizona inventory, and a lot of states, a lot of cities, San Francisco and Oakland, San Jose, Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, New York, Amherst, Boston, Columbus, Ohio, Bloomington, Indiana. All of these places have passed through their city councils official boycotts of Arizona, which means don't go to Arizona, don't buy anything from Arizona. And this is the way that the nation and many places are pushing back on what Arizona is doing. So this is a good thing. Now, if you think 1070 was it, well, it's not. It's like every day I open the newspaper and the Senate or the House has passed a new law that slaps you in the face. And after 1070, it was House Bill 2281, and there's no picture here again. And believe it or not, House Bill 2281 outlaws ethnic studies in general and Mexican American studies specifically. So this is an incredible slap in the face to so many people. And we do believe that it violates the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic minorities that tells us, quote, states shall protect the existence and the national or ethnic, cultural, religious, and linguistic identity of minorities within their respective territories and shall encourage conditions for the promotion of that identity. The United Nations further declares, quote, states shall take measures to create favorable conditions to enable persons belonging to minorities to express their characteristics and to develop their culture, language, religion, traditions, and customs. And so here is a major violation of international human rights laws. And actually, 5 people from the UN visited Arizona in April of 2010, and they denounced both Senate Bill 1070 and House Bill 2281 as measures that would most likely lead to a mass violation of human rights. And about this House Bill 2281, this group from the United Nations specifically stated, quote, such law and attitude are at odds with the state's responsibility to respect the rights of everyone to have access to their own cultural and linguistic heritage and to participate in cultural life. Everyone has the right to seek and develop cultural knowledge and to know and understand his or her own culture and that of others through education and information. So if that wasn't enough, I can go on and on about these bills, but one of the really interesting ones was this Senate Bill 1611, which the same man, Senate President Russell Pierce, put together. And he put together a whole new anti-immigrant bill, which included like 5 bills in one. And many newspapers have come out against this. And they're pointing Russell Pierce in the right direction, saying instead of holding hearings about these bills, he should be worried about the $2 billion structural budget deficit in Arizona, which no one was talking about. So what was this omnibus anti-immigrant bill, SB 1611? Well, it revokes citizenship for U.S.-born children of undocumented immigrants. That is, it revokes the 14th Amendment. It denies children K-12 education if their mothers and fathers can't produce a U.S. birth certificate. It forces hospital workers to confirm immigration status before providing any kind of medical care, including prenatal. And it goes on and on. The brutality of it is just really staggering. Now, how was this bill stopped? It was stopped. It was going to sail through. What happened is that 60 business people, CEOs, wrote a letter to Russell Pierce saying, you know, enough is enough, and we really think you should leave immigration reform to the federal government. But they also brought up this, quote, it is an undeniable fact that each of our companies and our employees were impacted by the boycotts and the coincident negative image. So the business people are seeing that, you know, Arizona is bad for business on top of being bad for human rights. In fact, an economic impact study showed that the Arizona hotel industry lost about $45 million in just the 4 months after passage of the Senate Bill 1070. And so this is a happening place. Here's a little cartoon to help us have some humor in this terrible situation. People of color, scapegoats, distraction from the real issues. Scapegoats are always something that distract from more urgent issues or problems. Point over there, and if nothing else, pointing at immigrants takes the heat off of the politicians who have wrecked the budget in Arizona. They don't know how to balance their checkbooks. And so here's the American Federation of Scapegoats, and it includes union members, as we've seen in Wisconsin and Ohio and many other states, Muslims, gays, Hispanics, and the jobless. And, you know, this is a horrible photo. This is our beloved Representative Gabrielle Giffords on January 8th. She was one of the 18 people shot in Tucson. 6 of them were shot to death, wounded mortally. And my own view of this is that the climate of hatred, of violence, and of loose gun control fosters acts of hatred, violence, and loose gun usage. Some people say, oh, come on, that has nothing to do with politics. But I personally believe that the climates, that political climate, social climate spiral and have a momentum and create, influence people. And it isn't just on that day that violence had been in the air. When Gabrielle Giffords was running for her seat, her opponent, for example, had a rally, and when he invited people to the rally, he said this, in terms of measuring the climate, quote, "Get on target for victory in November. Help remove Gabrielle Giffords from office. Shoot a fully automatic M16 with Jesse Kelly." The language is just incredible. And Giffords, prior to being shot, had said this, quote, "Sarah Palin has the crosshairs of a gun sight over our district. And when people do that, they've got to realize that there are consequences to that action." So I don't believe it was just some deranged man. I think that we all live in environments that create consequences. And so this is where Arizona is at. I wish I had more pleasant things to say, but I'll leave it at this. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to congratulate, very deeply congratulate all the students who participated in this absolutely wonderful day. And congratulate their faculty, their professors, for encouraging them to go beyond and to reach academic excellence. I think this is probably one of the most important days of our academic year, and I am very proud to be a part of it, so thank you for inviting me. I'm going to move a little bit. I'm going to talk about Franco-Americans. We could have a whole discussion, I guess, about hyphenated Americans. When I talk about Franco-Americans, I specifically mean descendants of French Canadians who come from either Acadia, which is the southern part of New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton, and later on Prince Edward Island, or Quebec, which is not quite visible on this slide, but is up here, like so, okay? I want to talk about specifically 2 groups at 2 different times. The first group is the group that settled in the Madawaska Territory in 1785. The Madawaska Territory is everything that is north and west of Grand Falls, and it spreads on either side of the St. John River. Massive, massive territory. In fact, Madawaska is a Mi'kmaq word, which means land of the porcupines. The Acadians and Quebecois, who settled in 1785 in the Madawaska Territory, hailed from this area in what is now Fredericton, New Brunswick, the capital of New Brunswick, but what was called Sainte-Anne-des-Pays-Bas, a very French settlement that was populated by Acadians who had either escaped the deportations or Acadians who had resettled there after the end of the deportations. When I talk of deportations, it's a massive genocide that occurred in between 1755 and 1763. French Catholics in Acadia, in Nova Scotia and the south of New Brunswick, were forcibly removed from their land and were deported not back to their homeland, but they were deported to the British colonies to the south. Soldiers who were seeking them. They died of malnutrition, and they died when ships capsized, but they also died in the British colonies to which they were exiled at the hands of the people who received them. Why? Because they were French Catholics, and they were going to mostly British, English Protestant colonies. And so in 1763, when the hostilities between France and England finally ended, and France ceded all of its territories, that is, all of New France and all of Acadia, to the British Crown, immediately the Acadians asked to return to their homes. And they did, by whichever way they could. And they settled in Sainte-Anne-des-Pays-Bas, and word got around, and people from Quebec and other people, other exiled coming back, came to settle, and in the course of 10, 20 years, this was a very thriving community. In the interim, the American Revolution happened. Now, the American Revolution, as we know, was the Yankees, or Americans, against the British Crown, and the Americans won. That meant that people who had sided with the Crown, that is, loyalist soldiers, and their families, who in some instances had been there, their families had been there for 2 or 3 generations, did not feel very comfortable staying in this new country, having been at war with their neighbors in many cases. And so they asked the British Crown, well, how do you reward us? We want to stay on this side of the continent, but we don't feel welcome. And the British Crown said, well, we have plenty of colonies to the north. And so in 1784, 1785, and 86, 44,000 loyalist soldiers and their families absolutely flooded the maritime provinces, and actually forced the creation of the province of Ontario and the separation of Canada into Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Well, what does this have to do with Franco-Americans? I'm getting there. The people who were settled in Sainte-Anne-des-Pays-Bas and had this lovely community, they had no deed to their properties because they were French and Catholics. They could not own land. They could not vote. They were not authorized to do so. The English loyalists came in and said, wow, what a nice little village. We think we're going to take over. And that is exactly what they did. So for many of the people living in Sainte-Anne-des-Pays-Bas, this was a second deportation. This time, when they left and they went so far north that they thought nobody will ever find us there. And they settled in the Madawaska territory. This is all before the boundary between Canada and the United States, this new country, was decided upon. And so these people were not immigrants. They were settlers. They were not the first settlers. When they came to the Madawaska territories, there were 60 Maliseet families living in the area of, in the area of Tissot. I'm not sure if I'm at the right place. Edmundston today, what is known as Edmundston today. So word got around, and very soon these few Acadians and Quebecois were joined by family and relatives either coming back from deportation or coming from Quebec where they had escaped. And it was one happy people. They were all French. They were all Catholic at the time. Who said French said Catholic. And they continued living as one very concise community, if I may use that term, for quite a while until the Scots and Irish came in the 1830s, around there. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, the next group I want to talk about is the French Canadians who came to Maine and to New England between 1830 and 1930. At the time, there was industrialization going on. There was a shortage of workers in Maine, an enormous need for skilled laborers. And so the United States opened its doors to immigrants. And so French Canadians from Quebec, 90% of them, so 900,000, came from Quebec. 100,000 came from Acadia. And they came to Maine and the New England states to work in the textile mills and the manufacturing companies and everything. Now, they did not believe that they were going to stay here indefinitely. They never believed that this was going to be their home. They believed that they would go until Quebec got industry going or created jobs, and they would return. And so they kept a very close link, and because it was close enough, it wasn't across the ocean, as for other ethnic communities, they went very often back to Quebec, and so they maintained their language, and they maintained their culture. And, you know, if you consider the sheer number, 1 million people who were Catholic, and so continued to populate very heavily in the years that followed, you can understand then that they would have very, very tight communities. This was seen, the sheer number of French Canadians who actually flooded Maine and New England, but specifically Maine, was seen as a major threat. First, it was seen as a political threat, in the sense that if all of these French Canadian voters decided to upset the government or the status quo, it could easily do so. They were also an economic threat because they could bring unions and they could actually upset the status quo in the textile mills where they were working. And they could obviously upset the cultural and ethnic demographics if they proposed to force their culture upon Americans or Anglo-Protestants. And so there became, or there started what I call a campaign of hate. It started in the 1890s, and it grew from politicians to industrialists, and it came to the point where the KKK was invited. It was invited to come to Maine to help fight this scourge of French Canadians. And they kept calling them French Canadians, not Americans, although, you know, a lot of Americans were born not long after the French Canadians came. They were the firstborn, first generation Americans, but they were never called Americans. They were always called French Canadians. So this is a picture of a textile mill. Oh, there you go.
I asked my father, and he said, oh yes, the KKK were there, and that he had witnessed one cross burning. And when I spoke to other people that we had interviewed, before, and I'd say, I understand the KKK was active in the area, and they'd go.
For me, it was just this whole thing of, you know, getting at the question of the shame and the secret
we had heard stories about the Ku Klux Klan, and when I realized that this was evidence of them right here in Maine, and that if they were burning a cross, I was very frightened.
You couldn't get anything out of them. It was like, this is not a subject to be discussed.
Almost 1 million French Canadians had flooded into the region's new factory towns. But they were different from other immigrants. They were not interested in assimilating, becoming Americanized. They had survived culturally through a fierce resistance to anything English. So the majority, never intending to stay, would return often to Quebec on what became a two-way immigration corridor from an archipelago of communities now so French they were sometimes referred to as Quebec en Sud, Lower Quebec.
Political structure of towns such as Lewiston, for instance, and others, reacted to what they perceived as an invasion, a cultural invasion coming from Quebec. And there was a million that came within a period of 50 years, so there were hordes, but they were invited. But at the same time, once they invited them, they saw that politically it could change their authority, it could diminish their authority.
After repressive language laws were enacted, there was an assault against the power of the French clergy, with help from the Irish Catholic Church. The right to have French priests, the right to pray in French, was lost. Our campaign against imagined political aspirations of Catholic French Canadians would soon evolve. It focused on repression of the French language.
But the deepest scar was left by a period most would like to forget, a time of real violence against us when the Ku Klux Klan tried to become the dominant political force in New England.
Religious and civic leaders brought the Klan to New England. Protestant clergymen enthusiastically admonished their congregations to join. By the mid-1920s, the Ku Klux Klan had memberships in the hundreds of thousands. States like Maine and Massachusetts had more Ku Klux Klan members than either Mississippi, Alabama, or any other southern state.
We had heard stories about things the Klan did, and I was afraid they might be coming to Maine to do some of the same things.
What would some of those things be?
Oh, the lynchings and the mob scenes, and the way they treated minorities.
Okay, did I just turn that off, or we'll see. We'll deal with that later. When I say campaign of hate, it wasn't just in the newspapers, but there was a stereotyping of French people, or people of French descent. They were called frogs. They were called lazy drunkards. They didn't know how to control themselves because they had so many children. They had to be, insane to have that many children. They were too lazy to learn English. In fact, many learned English. And the way that the descendants of French Canadians reacted to this was by, and with threat of the KKK looming, they went underground. Because they were of the same skin color as the ruling authority, they became an invisible minority. They changed their names, they lost their accent, and they refused to speak English to their children. They refused to continue speaking French to their children, so that their children would not be subjugated to the same, subjected to the same prejudices that they had been. It's a little bit of a different story in the St. John Valley. In the St. John Valley, because the group was so homogenous, French and Catholic, that even though after the Treaty of Webster-Ashburton in 1842 established the St. John River as the boundary between Canada and the United States, the French community of the St. John Valley continued to live its culture, its traditions, and its language. There were many links. Some brothers had land on one side, and another brother had land on the other side of the river. And so exchanges continued, very much so. My grandmother was born in 1886 in St. Francis, Maine, and she thought the boundary, this idea of a boundary, was just a nuisance. If she wanted something, she'd get in a canoe and she'd get across. And you know, that's where the supplies were, and that's what she would get them. That would be very interesting in a few years when my father became a customs officer. But that's another story. I'll see if I can, okay. The film clip that you saw before comes from a documentary created by Ben Levine, and it is called Réveil, Waking Up French. The people you saw interviewed were Amy Morin of Old Town and Yvon Labby of the Franco-American Center in Orono. This is a painting by Lise Pelletier from Fort Kent. And they talked about, in the clip, they talked about repressive language laws. In April 1st, 1919, Maine adopted a law that made it illegal to teach in any language other than English. And so a lot of the schools in this area, which were being run and taught by nuns or religious orders, they had to switch languages because they were using French. And so because a lot of these schools relied on state funding, then it became imperative for all the schools to comply to this new law. And so the teachers sometimes went overboard in their punishment of students. The punishments ran from copying like this to corporal punishment with wands and rulers and kneeling on sticks in a corner and whatever. And some actually had pretty devious plans as well. Some actually rewarded snitches. If they would tell the students, if you catch somebody in the playground speaking French and tell me, I will give you some bonus points. And so this created a very, very conflicting time. A time when children who are born and raised in a language are told that from one day to the other, they cannot use this essential tool of communication. This tool which is such a part of our identity and the vehicle by which we transmit culture and love and comfort and acceptance. This was deemed unacceptable and inferior. And so what developed unconsciously and at many different levels is a very degrading sense of self. Because if I am speaking in the only language I know, and you're telling me as an authority that it's not good enough, then who am I? I am inferior to you. That's obvious. And it plays out in many different ways. It plays out in linguistic insecurity, for one thing. If you speak to a lot of people in this area and you start speaking French with them, the first thing they say is, oh, I don't speak good French. I don't speak French well. I don't speak the real French. I was never schooled in it. And that is true. the language, the French language as a foreign language, really took a backseat, if you will. And so the language almost became lost. In the St. John Valley, it didn't become as lost because of the sheer number of people who continued to migrate on both sides of the river and continued to have interactions with French-speaking people and kept it up in their family. But overall, 40% of Mainers who are of French-Canadian descent, of the 40%, there are only 7% left who speak the language. And so what do we do about that, you know? And how do we make this situation better? I believe that education is one of the ways we can make it better. Unfortunately, for the last couple of decades, there have been a number of bills proposed at the legislative house, and they've been turned down. And those bills aim to make it mandatory for social studies to carry the history of Franco-Americans. That is, carry the history, the contributions of Franco-Americans, Acadians, Quebecois, to the state of Maine. And they have not been accepted. So at this point in time, no teacher is obligated to teach about Franco-Americans or Acadians in any schoolroom because it's not mandatory, it's not part of the state curriculum. And so how do we go around that? Because you're talking about if you lose the language, then the culture follows. And one way to go around it is to educate people by not necessarily focusing on the negative, but focusing on the positive of the culture, the sense of community, the generosity of spirit of the community. In fact, the St. John Valley is known for that. The work ethics, for example. And there are some other ways. In 1994, interestingly enough, an organization was created, and it was called Save Our French. And later the name was changed to l'Association Française de la Vallée Saint-Jean. They created a committee to go into schools and to try to revitalize the language, which is, eroding every year. We're losing almost a generation. There is also Madawaska, the town that's 20 miles of here, has celebrated the Acadian Festival, the culture of this area, for the last 33 years. And that brings a great deal of pride. And once you have pride, you start raising the self-esteem. And once you have self-esteem, people start believing in themselves, and they empower themselves to do something different and to change their attitudes about themselves. But you can't force it, and it has to come within, and then it's much more powerful. And this is one of the endeavors that I'm working on right now, and it's the World Acadian Congress. Like the Franco-Americans, Acadians, as I was telling you, were dispersed. We talk about the Acadian diaspora. The Cajuns, for example, are cousins to the Acadians. And though they were never deported to Louisiana, they chose to go there on their own. They have actually found a niche by marketing their culture and their cuisine and their music. And so maybe that's one way we can do it. We have a World Acadian Congress coming to our area that is the territory of Madawaska, as I showed you, encompassing parts of Témiscouata, Quebec, northwestern New Brunswick, and the northern region of Maine, where there are a great number of French-speaking people. And we celebrate the fact that we share this culture and this language, every 5 years, and there are a number of conferences going on. But the biggest excuse, if I may use that term, for the event is the culture, is sustenance of the culture and looking forward. How would this culture change in time? How would it evolve? But how will it survive in the face of growing ethnicities and growing diversity? And c'est tout. Voilà.
Maybe 5 or 6 minutes of questions, and then I think Rachel, are you still here? Yeah, Rachel's going to come up, and Dr. Albert, our Vice President for Academic Affairs, will come up and give us a few parting words. I would ask is if you have questions, speak loudly and make sure you direct the question to one of our individual speakers, please. Anyone with a question?
So your question is, how do so-called illegal immigrants benefit the economy? It has to do with the fact of being what some people call illegal, or I like to refer to it as undocumented, that when they go to work, they don't have papers that you need in order to get a job. In Arizona, as in perhaps other places, you need a social security card, because technically your employers are supposed to make deductions for social security and Medicare and federal taxes, state taxes. And so they, there's two things. They do pay, gasoline tax, sales tax, gross, regular, every time you buy something you hand over taxes, but the other deductions that they make through paychecks often are, they do not derive any benefits. They can never claim Social Security. Those are fake Social Security cards, and so the Social Security Administration is reaping, billions that they're never going to give back, and the same holds true for Medicare. And that's one way in which they benefit the economy. Another way is through the extremely low wages, the exploitative wages that they often accept out of desperation or the will to survive. And so some people have said, oh, they're taking away the work from Americans, but in fact there have been whole campaigns that to show that a lot of the work they do, lettuce picking, all kinds of agricultural activity, no one who has any other recourse wants to do that, because it's really hard work working in the fields, especially in the areas of the Southwest where, like, the lettuce picking right now happens in a very strange way. They actually bus in, buses and buses and buses of people from the other side of the border, and they do all the lettuce picking and cucumbers and whatever is there, and then they bus them back at night. And so it is in 115-degree sun. It's killer work. It's killer work. And so most people who have the ability or papers, documents, will find work somewhere else. And so they bring riches to corporations by working for very, very low wages. So those are two ways in which I can talk about how they boost the economy.
Another question. Go ahead, David.
Close enough. My name is Euros, but you can call me Ross if that's more convenient. I'm just kidding.
Just asking, are there any strong historical claims or land claims, territorial claims of the different ethnic groups in the Balkans? Something that would be legitimate for specifically like the Serbs, for example? Or like, were there any, or it was not clearly defined?
Excellent question. Short answer is yes. The other short answer is no, and this is what I mean by that. You have a number of different ethnic groups that have legitimate rights. And it's not simply a philosophical question, but a very practical question. What do we do when we had multiple rights conflict? What we have had in former Yugoslavia, in general in the Balkans, and one can argue in a number of other places in the world, including Middle East, is claims on rights and ultimately claims on justice, thus the title Willing the Justice. If you have those rights, how do you pick which one is righter than the other? That's exactly what happened, let's say, with the Serbs and the Croats, where Serbs argued for their right to remain constitutive people within what was known as Yugoslavia. That was guaranteed by the Constitution of '74. The Croats, based on the same constitution, claimed their right for self-determination, including secession. Therefore, when you have those rights, the cultural aspects of territoriality come into the claim. If that has been part of the historical narrative, then you have multiple rights, thus the conflicts. And what really precipitates the conflicts ultimately then is what type of nationalizing forces do we have? That's why some people even call it radical suggestions to abolish nationalization as such. In former Yugoslavian case, for example, to impose secularization. I would of course not do that elsewhere, but over there, religion historically has played very negative roles throughout its history, be it it's Roman Catholicism, Christian Orthodoxy, or Islam. So you have these rights that conflict, and as a result, you have legitimate claims. And the only way to resolve them is through what? Exactly.
Any other questions? Diana?
Dr. Gonzalez, I very much appreciate your talk this morning and your very clear discussion of ways of making peace. It sounded to me like you had written a book or an article or something, and I wondered what that was and if it was available for us to learn more.
So if I understand your question is whether I have written or published something on the ways of peace that I spoke about this morning. I haven't published anything like that. This is something that I spent weeks preparing for this. However, I have a book coming out in the fall that is it's the life-telling of a Native American elder from the Chumash tribe in California. And her life story, and then my 100-page analysis of it, focuses entirely, it has a slant, put it that way, and it focuses on the concept of healing from the genocide, from the enslavement of the tribes, from the incredible historical violence. And so that book coming out in the fall is a related work, and it's called Earth Wisdom. It's coming out with the University of Arizona Press. But I haven't published anything as succinct as this about, here are the peace ways. But I have lectured before, primarily focusing on the Native American peace ways that are really numerous, and today I just included them as one of many different ways that are available there. But thank you for your interest in this, because it's a growing interest of mine. I'm also working on a book on Cesar Chavez, the civil rights leader, and I collaborated with him intensely before he died and invited him to give a series of lectures, and he spoke a lot about nonviolence and how he grew in nonviolence. So that book will also be a focus on peace ways. But this is thus far not published. Thank you.
you assess that situation, both Lise and Dr. Gonzalez and Lady Wilson?
Personally, I've seen a drastic change. I grew up actually crossing the border every single day. Not only because my family was half on one side and half on the other, but because I liked ice cream. There's a Dickies here. We actually knew the police officers, the customs officers by name. In Canada, they were always the ambassadors, and because I grew up in a home where my father was a customs officer and thereafter a superintendent, I always understood the reason why there was a border, and it was to protect the economy. That was very clear. At the same time, the people you meet at the border are also your first contact with that nation, the nation you are entering. And so it was very, very personable. My dad was very good friends with a number of customs officers on the American side. They socialized a lot. They always asked, you know. The other night I came by, and they've known me forever, and one of them, and this was totally very different, said, "Hey, guess what? I met your sister the other day. She lives in Scarborough, just where I lived," and da-da-da-da. And it was totally very, very different. My mother comes from Eagle Lake, grew up in, you know, she came to school in Madawaska Training School. She was a beauty queen. Everybody knew her. Well, one day I was crossing with her, and she was 78 years old at the time. And I know every customs officer, and Mom is a little bit hard of hearing. And she was driving, and the customs officer asked her, do you have anything to declare? Are you bringing, and he asked the two questions almost simultaneously, are you bringing anything with you? And she didn't quite hear what she says. Well, I'm bringing my daughter here home, you know, and as I'm not bringing any merchandise, but, and well, that wasn't, he was a very young customs officer, newly minted, I think, and he got very, very impatient, and at one point, he yelled at her, "Ov tavalish," and my mother just looked at me and said, she said, "Babe, what did he just say?" I said, "I'm gonna get out of the car, Mom, and you need to open the trunk," because that's what he said. I just could not get over it, and I kept thinking, what do you think she's crossing? You know, it has changed, and it's not just coming back into the States. The other day, my husband and I, who, my husband has practiced law all his life and is now a judge, we were on our way to Clare. We were stopped before reaching the bridge. We were stopped by American Border Patrol officers. And we were asked what we were crossing. And we said, "Well, nothing. Where are you going?" And I'm thinking, well, why does he need to know that? I mean, that's... and Dave said, "Well, we're going to my mother-in-law's." "What are you going to do there?" And I'm thinking, what does that have to do with anything? And at some point Dave said, "Excuse me, but why are you asking all these questions?" And instead of answering, the officer deflected completely and just adopted this very militaristic style and said, "I'm sorry, this is my job. I'm sorry if you do not agree, but you have to answer the questions." And Dave said, "Listen, I'm just asking why. What is going on here? I mean, is there a report, or is there kidnapping going on, or, you know, what's..." And he would not answer. And at some point Dave said, "You know, I'm not exactly sure if this is constitutional." So that's, otherwise, you know, I mean, because I'm such a regular, I guess, and I do have a citizenship. I do have my passport, and I'm a very known quantity. I usually don't have any problems, but it has drastically changed.
I'm wondering if the change isn't like an echo from the South, where things are so brutal. And
9/11.
when I heard you 9/11 too, but you know, when I heard you say that you're questioning a border patrol person, I couldn't imagine any of us doing that. Period. You keep your mouth shut, or you could be raped, beaten, incarcerated, or God knows what. And so it's really, for us, the border is racialized insofar as it's the prolongation or new manifestation of very old race relations. We did not have civil rights until, you know, well, I'm not sure we have civil rights. We have endeavored to create civil rights for people of color in the Southwest, and they are still tenuous, put it that way. And the treatment and the racial profiling on the border, that people that look a certain way are automatically suspected of being illegal, has an old history. We are viewed as outlaws in our own lands, and that this is but the newest manifestation of that. And one of the interesting things about so-called illegal immigrants is that I've heard people make claims that most of the illegal immigrants are whites and not dark peoples, the hordes coming from the South. They're Polish people in Chicago, or Canadian whites, etc. And that, in fact, still, however, the illegal is stereotyped as a brown person, and it makes it very painful for me to live in my ancestral homeland and carry my passport with me, as I have it right now in my purse. I have my passport because I told my mom, oh, we're going to be near the border. She says, well, you better take your passport, you know, and it's scary. And I haven't looked out there, but do you have one of these walls out there anywhere? The militarized zone? No, and I didn't think it was there. And so it's curious that it's this stereotyping and scapegoating. And I have an anecdote concerning my partner, who was driving with a friend from Germany, and sure enough, they were pulled over by the border patrol, and our friend Bernd from Germany was already fretting, saying, "Oh, I didn't bring my papers with me," and my husband, in fact, the border patrol took my husband out of the car and started questioning him because he's brown. He never asked the blonde, blue-eyed German who was not carrying papers for papers, because he was beyond suspicion. So this phenotype, how you look, has led really to what in that one poster was called the criminalization of whole communities, where you really, where you really feel pursued. You feel like you have to look over your shoulder, carry a passport, and a lot of people that I know have been in that part of the country for thousands of years, as I know my family has. We suddenly feel like we don't belong there, and that's really a terrible feeling, because it's feeling like you don't belong is feeling that you're not treated as a human being. So it's a terrible time in Arizona, and I feel that it's worse than the terrible time that made me leave in the 1970s. That's one reason I took off for Germany and stayed there for 12 years. I could not stand being a brown person in Arizona, and now I'm feeling the same way. So thank you for that question.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank our speakers. We give them one more round of applause. That'd be great. I have some small gifts that I'd like to give them. Before I walk over and give them, I'll let you know that Lise already has hers. So if you want to know why she doesn't get one, it's not a slight.
Well, thank you.
Rachel to come up and give some closing remarks. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Bruno. I know it's been late, but it's been a great, great academic day, and I thank you for giving me a few minutes to bring this event to a closure. We come from different places, and we have many different stories, histories, and cultures, but the power of the individual is certainly is amazing, and we learned that today from our presenters, as well as last night from Max Lobotsky's Holocaust kickoff presentation. And I too want to thank our panelists for participating in this event and for sharing your passion, your knowledge, and your expertise on the topic of culture, conflict, and convergence. Dr. Yolanda Gonzalez, Uros Petrovich, Lise Pelletier, thank you for an excellent panel presentation and discussion this afternoon. And thanks to Dr. Gonzalez and Uros Petrovich for joining us at the University of Maine at Fort Kent, and we hope that you have safe and happy returns. This symposium has exceeded my expectation, and I hope yours as well. UMFK has invested a lot of time in this day because we certainly do recognize the value of an engaged community of scholars. And I imagine that many of you who came today were wondering if this would be a worthwhile event for you, and I hope that you've come to realize what a fantastic event this has been. It's been exciting, rewarding, exhilarating. It's been a fantastic day around a fantastic theme. Because of all of you, students, faculty, staff, presenters, and participants, you've made us proud, you've raised the bar, and you've added great value and also elevated the profile of a small rural campus community by sharing your scholarly achievements. Collaborative events such as this one certainly strengthens our ties to each other and to the community. We now are able to carry on a conversation about the importance of undergraduate research and the benefits to our students' academic and career preparation and their future impact on lives that they're going to change and better futures that they'll help to create. And I thank each of you for making UMFK's Scholar Symposium such a success. I enjoyed the wonderful collection and display of your intellectual works on diverse topics from a variety of disciplines. This has been a truly special intellectual gathering. I learned a lot. I hope you have as well. I only wish that I would have had the opportunity to attend all of the sessions. The posters and the art projects were just incredibly amazing and very, very professionally done. We have many presenters, and I know that everybody's not here, but for those of you who did present today, either an oral presentation, a project, or whatever, please stand so that we can give you a round of applause. I'd also like to call upon Dr. Cardenas to come up because we did have a panel of judges who judged the posters and art projects in the gymnasium, and we have the winners. We have a few winners that we'd like to mention.
We had two categories this year. We had the most scholarly poster project and the most creative and aesthetic poster project. For the most scholarly poster project, the winner this year is Brad Hubert for his poster on moose disease. So I don't think, if you see Brad, let him know, because there is a gift certificate for money. And we have here for the most creative and aesthetic poster project goes to Alicia Gould. Well, I'll see her next week when she takes her final.
Sorry, I don't move yet. I also wanted to announce that 3 of Dr. Shariah Cardenas' students will be presenting their posters at the research day at the Capitol, And I want to thank them for representing UMFK, and do you know who the presenters are?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, do you want to?
We have Bridget Hughes, we have Bradley Hubert, and we also have Max, I can't say his last name, but thank you. And I do want to invite everybody this Sunday at 7 p.m. for my students who did a documentary. It's about 33 minutes in length. It's good at 7 p.m. in the Fox Auditorium too.
So thank you to those students who are going to represent UMFK at the Research Day at the Capitol. Thank you so much. I also want to thank Joan Lee for the beautiful drawing on the symposium posters that you've seen. It's just absolutely fabulous, and I want to recognize her for that and thank her for that. And all of these fine works and presentations would not have been possible without the guidance of faculty. And I know that not everybody is here right now, but again, I'd like to take this opportunity to just give a round of applause to those faculty because of the wonderful guidance that they've given our students. And again, I want to re-acknowledge, and I know President Hess did this morning and others have, but I want to recognize and acknowledge the hard work and the dedication of the symposium committee members that are listed in your program. And I want to especially thank, from the bottom of my heart, Dr. Soraya Cardenas for her unwavering leadership and others who responded to the call and the desire to elevate the intellectual discourse on this campus and to enhance our students' academic and research skills outside the classroom. And I know that Soraya and others are committed to this event, and President Hess and I pledge our continued support and institutional support for this event on an annual basis, and we are certainly grateful and thankful for the funding assistance received from the Libra Foundation and the Student Senate to make this event possible. And I look forward to next year's theme. And again, thank you for a wonderful intellectual day and for being a part of the 2nd Annual Scholar Symposium. And this concludes our event, and have a great weekend and a great week next week with commencement activities. Thank you so very much.